Okay, let's dive right into this explainer on the escalating strategic tension between the United States and Iran. We're going to be breaking down a highly complex geopolitical chessboard today, looking directly at the latest facts on the ground. Whether you've been closely tracking Middle Eastern diplomacy for years or, you're just trying to make sense of the latest headlines, we are mapping out exactly how these maritime skirmishes and really strict nuclear negotiations are colliding. And understanding this is absolutely crucial because a single spark in the specific region has the potential to send massive shockwaves through the global economy and, frankly, affect all of our daily lives. To set the immediate high-stakes context for our analysis, we need to look at a highly forceful quote documented in the source material. Right after overnight self-defense strikes by the United States, we saw a defiant response from Iran's supreme leader. He stated, "The hands of time will not turn back," and he's now actively calling for an absolute end to U.S. military bases in the Gulf region. Look, this isn't just rhetoric, it's a very clear signal of the intensely rigid positions both sides are currently holding. So, to make sense of all this, we're going to break the conflict down into 5 distinct arenas: the overnight escalation, the maritime front, the nuclear ultimatum, science and proxies, and finally, high-stakes diplomacy. All right, part 1, the overnight escalation and the immediate action taken. Let's establish the specifics of what literally just happened. The United States conducted its first strikes in the region since early May, which CENTCOM explicitly described as defensive in nature. These strikes targeted southern Iran, specifically right near the crucial Strait of Hormuz. And the targets weren't just random. U.S. forces pinpointed Iranian mine-laying vessels and surface-to-air missile launchers. The source notes that a U.S. spokesperson warned any new aggression will be met with a far more severe response. To put this into perspective and understand why this location matters so much, roughly 20% of the world's liquid petroleum passes through this exact bottleneck. So hitting targets here is essentially like playing with matches in a global powder keg. Moving right along to part 2, the maritime front and securing the waterways. We are looking at 2 totally competing maritime policies at play here, which really form the bedrock of this whole tension. On one side, you have Iran's strategy. The source reports they're actually laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz to deliberately disrupt international shipping. They view this disruption as a critical piece of leverage, basically an economic chokehold that forces the international community to pay attention. Directly contrasting this is the United States strategy. U.S. officials, including Marco Rubio, are unequivocally demanding an immediately open waterway. They are insisting the straits be open, unimpeded, and operating without any tolls whatsoever. A toll-free, secure shipping lane is the absolute cornerstone of U.S. maritime policy to ensure the global supply chain doesn't just grind to a halt. Now, you might be wondering, why rely on these small, asymmetrical mine-laying vessels in the first place? Well, according to the source material, Iran is kind of running out of cards to play. Look back at last summer. The source states Iran's nuclear program was heavily targeted during Operation Midnight Hammer, and their traditional military and navy were systematically dismantled during Operation Epic Fury. I mean, imagine losing a major naval fleet. You would naturally rely on whatever asymmetric resources you have left, right? And that is exactly what Iran is doing today, using these remaining small boats as their primary source of physical, real-world leverage. Which brings us to part 3, the nuclear ultimatum and existential leverage. So the source highlights a highly specific and strict condition laid out by President Trump in a Truth Social post. He explicitly stated that Iran's enriched uranium must either be immediately turned over to the United States and brought home to be destroyed, or, alternatively, it must be dismantled at an acceptable location while being directly witnessed by the Atomic Energy Agency. There is absolutely zero ambiguity in this demand. The strategic goal outlined here is to entirely remove Iran's path to a nuclear weapon by eliminating the material itself, removing any chance at all of a covert continuation. Okay, so how is Iran reacting to this? Outlining the likely responses to this strict ultimatum, the source indicates it is highly unlikely Tehran will ever agree to hand over their highly enriched uranium directly to the U.S. Instead, Iranian state media has floated a few alternatives. For one, they've suggested the idea of exporting the material to China. By floating China as an export destination, Tehran is actively attempting to leverage alternative global superpowers to bypass direct U.S. control. On top of that, they're exploring options for dismantling the material internally, essentially reversing the enrichment process themselves. They want to maintain at least a semblance of control over the material's ultimate fate. Let's dive into part 4, science, proxies, and the ripple effects. Let's actually walk step by step through the mechanics of uranium enrichment, as detailed in the source, because understanding the science really helps us grasp the geopolitical anxiety here. It starts with iron ore in the ground, which undergoes a chemical reaction to become yellow cake. Next, that yellow cake is converted into what is known as hex, which is a fluoride gas. Now here's where the critical engineering comes in. That hex gas is spun inside advanced centrifuges, and these centrifuges spin at supersonic speeds. It's engineering so precise that any tiny flaw would literally tear the machines apart. Through that extreme centrifugal force, the heavier particles are pushed to the outside, while the lighter, highly desired particles stay in the middle. Repeating this exact, delicate process creates highly enriched uranium. And the overarching U.S. goal is to ensure Iran absolutely cannot complete or maintain this specific scientific capability. Widening our lens beyond just the centrifuges, we can see this tension intensely fueling other regional conflicts. The source reports that Israel has vowed to strike Iran's largest proxy group, Hezbollah, with overwhelming force. This is a direct reaction to ongoing drone and rocket attacks being launched against Israel from southern Lebanon. Because Iran funds and directs Hezbollah, any action against Israel by this group is widely viewed as a direct extension of Tehran's own aggression. It's a stark reminder for sure that U.S.-Iran tension doesn't exist in a vacuum. The ripple effects are felt daily across the borders of neighboring nations. And finally, Part 5. High-stakes diplomacy at the Doha summit. It's kind of a wild geopolitical reality, isn't it? Missiles are flying overnight, yet by morning, diplomats are literally sitting at the table in Qatar. A regional diplomat confirmed that Iran's parliament speaker and foreign minister remain in Doha to hammer out specific details. They're negotiating safe passage in the Strait of Hormuz and the immensely complicated logistics of exporting that highly enriched uranium we just talked about. The Qatari government is playing an absolutely critical role here, specifically facilitating the complex economic elements of these negotiations behind the scenes. So Qatar is positioned at the heart of a massive transactional standoff. On one side are the required concessions from Iran, and on the other, the potential economic outcomes. The source emphasizes that Iran will absolutely not receive sanctions relief or oil waivers unless they strictly adhere to their end of the deal. However, if they do concede, specifically by exporting the uranium and entirely seizing their shipping disruptions, it could eventually trigger the release of frozen Iranian funds that are currently tied up in Qatari banks. This is basically the ultimate carrot and stick approach applied to international diplomacy. The source explicitly contrasts the diplomatic strategy being proposed right now with the past. According to the source's analysis, the goal is to avoid what they view as the missteps of the previous Obama administration. The source claims that previously provided funds were channeled by the Iranian regime directly back into their own missile and drone programs. In stark contrast, the current demands insist on strict, verifiable adherence to all conditions before a single dollar of sanctions relief is granted. This is purposefully designed to prevent any propping up of Iran's military capabilities moving forward. And that brings us to the ultimate unknown. As these incredibly complex negotiations continue in Doha right amid the backdrop of literal airstrikes, we are left with a massive question to ponder. Will the combination of targeted maritime strikes and strict, uncompromising nuclear ultimatums successfully force a lasting diplomatic agreement? Or is this dual-front strategy simply going to push the conflict into a new, even more unpredictable battlefield? The whole world is watching to see if the net will hold. What do you think is going to happen next?